if you look at how a major charity or really any nonprofit organization operates today, there's this there is a very strict expectation of absolute financial precision.
Oh, absolutely. It's
And
all about risk mitigation.
right. You have these, board meetings where accountants are just poring over balance sheets. You've got your reserve accounts, sinking funds, diversified donor portfolios.
And crisis management strategies for every possible scenario.
Exactly. The board of directors, they look at the spreadsheets, they point to the safety net, and they say, there it is. We are secure. We can weather the storm.
Yeah, but that corporate model is entirely built on human predictability. Like, we find comfort in seeing the math actually work out.
We really do.
We want our security to be visible, heavily categorized, and, legally insured against every conceivable disaster.
But, and this is where it gets crazy, when you step into the world of 19th century Bristol, England, you enter the life of a man who built an absolute empire of orphanages, and suddenly that entire corporate balance sheet it's thrown completely out the window.
Completely discarded.
We are looking at an organizational landscape that defies every modern metric of financial responsibility. I mean, it is a masterclass in operating without a single human safety net.
The scale of what we're talking about here, it really cannot be overstated. George Müller, he lives from 1805 to 1898, and over the course of his life, he constructed these massive stone buildings on Ashley Down.
Yeah.
And he ultimately cared for over 10,000 orphan children. But the crucial context here, the thing that fundamentally shifts how we have to look at this material, is his primary motivation.
Right, because he wasn't simply a 19th century social worker.
No, not at all.
Which is almost counterintuitive, right? Considering the sheer volume of human suffering he alleviated. I mean, he essentially built a small town for abandoned children.
He did. But the social work, as monumental as it was actually the byproduct of a much larger singular obsession.
Yeah.
Müller explicitly recorded in his personal journals that he founded these orphanages to provide visible, undeniable proof to a highly skeptical world and a deeply doubting church, honestly, that God is a living God.
A living God who still acts.
Right. He wanted to demonstrate empirically that the God of the Bible still hears and answers prayer in the present day. The orphans were, the living, breathing evidence of a theological premise.
Wow. Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are immersing ourselves in a truly astonishing stack of sources centered around a compilation of his life and journals called Answers to Prayer.
It's an incredible text.
It really is. And our mission for this deep dive, the lens through which we want to examine all of this, is to explore how this remarkable historical text inspires Christians today, inspires you to love Christ more deeply and to live for him more fully in the gritty, anxiety-inducing reality of your own daily life.
And to get there, to really unpack that,
Yeah.
we have to grapple with the most staggering historical fact of his entire operation.
The fundraising. Or rather, the complete absence of it.
Exactly.
Over his lifetime, he funded this massive enterprise, raising what would equate to tens of millions of pounds in today's currency, without ever, not even once, directly asking a single human being for a penny.
It's hard to even wrap your mind around that.
There were no fundraising banquets. There were no emotional newsletter appeals. There were no, wealthy patrons he quietly took out to dinner. He relied exclusively on prayer.
Yeah, and if someone asked him point blank if the orphanage was in financial trouble, he would often just refuse to tell them. He'd state simply that God knew the need.
It challenges the very foundation of how we believe things get accomplished in the real world. We operate on leverage, networking, influence. He operated on a completely different currency.
He really did.
But, a person doesn't just wake up one morning and decide to feed thousands of children based on invisible resources. To understand the dramatic stories of money miraculously arriving in the mail, we have to go backward.
Right, we have to look at the bedrock.
Exactly. We have to understand the theology and the intensely private daily habits that made a public life of that magnitude possible. It begins with his scriptural foundation, the absolute priority of the word before the petition.
And this requires dismantling the assumption that Müller was simply, born a giant of the faith.
Yeah, he wasn't.
No, he actively admitted that for the first 4 years of his Christian life, he was a spiritual babe. He fell into a trap that is incredibly common today, actually. He preferred reading printed sermons, commentaries, and religious books over reading the actual text of the Bible.
Oh, man. It is so much easier to read someone else's synthesized thoughts about God than to wrestle with the raw text yourself. It's safe. It's pre-digested.
Pre-digested, exactly.
Right.
But in August 1829, he underwent a radical methodology shift. He began a disciplined, consecutive reading of the Old and New Testaments.
He stopped cherry-picking verses for comfort.
Right. He started systematically absorbing the entire narrative of Scripture. And this wasn't just, a new reading plan. It rewired his entire theological approach to God.
Yeah.
His prayer life ceased to be about whipping himself up into a state of emotional frenzy. It became grounded in rigorous exegesis.
The sources highlight that he developed what theologians refer to as a Johannine theology of prayer, drawing heavily from the Apostle John's writings, specifically passages like John 15.7. If you abide in me and my words abide in you, ask whatever you wish, and it will be done for you.
And notice the sequence in that verse.
Yeah.
The internalizing of Christ's actual words must precede the asking. Alignment with the mind of God is the prerequisite for moving the hand of God.
I have to pause here and push back on this a little bit, because when a modern listener hears a phrase like, ask whatever you wish and it will be done for you, or when they read Mark 11.24, which says, believe that you have received it and it will be yours, alarm bells start ringing.
Oh, for sure.
To a 21st century ear, that sounds dangerously close to a theological blank check. It sounds like the prosperity gospel, right?
Yep.
Where faith is treated as a metaphysical currency you use to purchase the outcomes you want. How did a man claiming to live entirely by faith not fall into the trap of trying to manifest his own reality?
Well, that is the defining tension of his entire theology. The historical record shows Müller heavily guarded against that exact presumption.
Okay.
He vehemently rejected the idea that faith is some subjective psychological intensity. This idea that if you just squeeze your eyes shut and believe really hard that you're going to get a shiny new carriage, God is obligated to deliver it.
So faith isn't a mechanism for divine manipulation.
Precisely the opposite. For Müller, faith only operates within the strict boundaries of God's revealed will. You cannot have faith for something God hasn't promised.
Right.
The sources point out his heavy reliance on the Lord's Prayer in Matthew 6. When Jesus teaches his disciples to pray, thy kingdom come, thy will be done, the original Greek for be done is genetheto. It's an aorist passive imperative.
Okay, break down what that grammatical structure actually means for the person praying.
So an imperative is a command, right?
Yeah.
But it's in the passive voice. The person praying is not commanding God to do something for them. They are commanding themselves to submit to whatever God is doing.
Oh, wow.
It is a profound, terrifying submission. It essentially means, let your will be enacted upon me. Prayer is relentlessly God-centered before it ever becomes need-centered.
So for you, listening right now, if your goal is to love Christ deeply in your daily life, this is where it actually begins. It starts with prioritizing his actual words over the podcasts, over the latest self-help books, over the cultural commentaries.
Yes.
True faith operates far beyond what is humanly possible, but it operates strictly within the confines of divine revelation.
And that boundary is what gave him such unshakable confidence. He never had to guess what God wanted to do because he was saturating his mind in what God had already said.
Knowing the word is the baseline. But Müller didn't stop at general submission. He actually wrote out his own personal framework, 5 absolute prerequisites for prayer to be answered.
Right, his 5 conditions.
It feels like trying to access a high-security vault. You don't just wander in off the street and start grabbing whatever you want. You need the right key, the right security clearance, and the correct authorization.
That framework is the operational engine of the Ashley Down orphanages. The first condition is entire dependence on the merits of Christ, drawing from John 14.
Okay.
You're not approaching the vault based on your own track record of goodness.
Yeah.
The key is Christ's perfect record.
And the second condition is where the security clearance comes in, separation from all known sin. The sources reference Psalm 66.1 sin. If I regard iniquity in my heart, the Lord will not hear me.
And the Hebrew linguistic roots here are fascinating and deeply convicting. The word for regard implies seeing with pleasure, gazing upon fondly, or harboring secretly.
So it's not just making a mistake.
No, it's talking about a pet sin, a habit, an attitude, or a secret behavior that you know contradicts God's character, but you refuse to let go of it.
You're trying to ask a holy God to finance your endeavors while actively maintaining a private life that grieves him?
Exactly. Müller believed that unconfessed sin creates a literal, structural obstruction to prayer. It clogs the channel, the universe is moral, and God is holy. You cannot expect dynamic communion with the divine if you are knowingly maintaining a fractured moral coherence.
Wow. Okay, so the third condition is faith in God's promises, trusting his character. The fourth is asking according to his will, which we just discussed, but The fifth commission is the one that really challenges our modern desire for instant gratification.
Importunity.
Importunity, persistence, refusal to give up.
Which naturally raises a theological dilemma, right?
Yeah.
If God is omniscient and already knows exactly what we need, and if he is inherently loving and wants to provide it, why do we have to ask more than once? Why the delay?
Because the temptation is to view persistent prayer as a negotiation tactic. Like, if I ask 1,000 times, God will eventually get exhausted and cave to my demands.
Müller fundamentally rejected that view. He stated that prayer is not about overcoming God's reluctance, it's about laying hold of his willingness. The delay is not a denial. The delay is a highly calculated instrument of spiritual maturation.
It's the gym where the muscle of faith is actually built.
Exactly. If God answered every prayer the second it was uttered, we treat him like a cosmic vending machine. We would love the provision, but we would never develop a relationship with the provider. God delays to mature the believer, to burn away impure motives, and to build endurance. The trial of faith is the very food that makes faith grow.
This is the moment to pause and examine your own posture. When you approach God with a need, are you coming with a sense of modern entitlement? Or are you coming with a heart rigorously checked for unconfessed sin?
Yeah.
And are you genuinely willing to wait, recognizing that the agonizing delay might be the exact tool God is using for your own ultimate growth?
It completely reframes the anxiety of an unanswered prayer. It shifts it from a sign of God's absence to a sign of his active fatherly discipline.
But this entire framework hinges on a massive practical issue. You have the vault key, you have the moral clearance, you're prepared to wait for years if necessary. But how do you actually know if what you are asking for is God's will?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right. If you get the target wrong, the entire system collapses. Müller couldn't afford to be wrong. And so he developed a heavily tested 6-step formula for discerning the divine will.
He essentially turned spiritual discernment into a reproducible, objective discipline. And the steps he outlined are radically countercultural to how we make decisions today.
Let's walk through these slowly. Step 1. Surrender the heart to have no will of its own in the matter.
He argued that 9/10 of the difficulty is overcome right in this first step. The psychological friction here is immense.
I can imagine.
It means bringing yourself to a state where you are entirely ready to do God's will, whatever it may be, even if it is the exact painful opposite of what you'd naturally desire.
Step 2. Do not rely on mere feelings or impressions. And step 3, which is intimately tied to it, seek the Spirit through the written word.
Today, the ultimate cultural advice is to trust your gut or follow your heart. We elevate our internal subjective feelings to the level of ultimate truth.
Yeah, that's everywhere.
Müller did the exact opposite. He believed the human heart is deeply deceitful. He completely distrusted emotional impulses, insisting that the Holy Spirit will only ever guide a person in strict accordance with the written scriptures.
Step 4. Note providential circumstances. Step 5. Pray specifically. And step 6. Reach a deliberate, peaceful judgment.
Let's look at how he actually applied this in real life, because the historical journals provide a fascinating example. The story of how he decided to marry Miss Mary Groves.
I have to admit, reading this account, the entire process feels incredibly clinical. It practically strips all the romance out of the equation.
Oh, it is the absolute antithesis of a Hollywood love story.
He's a young pastor. He rationally concludes it might be beneficial for his ministry to be married. A trusted friend gives him the address of a highly regarded, godly woman, a Miss Paget. He takes this card, puts it in his pocket, and carries it around for 3 solid weeks without calling on her.
Just waiting.
Yeah, he's waiting to see if his own desires are driving the timeline. Finally, he senses peace to go, which leads him to travel to preach in Exeter. While there, he stays at a house where a different woman, Miss Mary Groves, happens to be assisting the family, and he realizes very quickly that he has developed strong feelings for her.
Now, a modern person would say, this is fate. Follow your heart. Propose immediately.
But instead of acting on that powerful emotion, he completely hits the brakes. He undergoes this long, intense period of prayerful conflict. He interrogates his own soul because he wants to ensure he isn't just acting on what he called fleshly excitement.
Wow.
He refuses to move forward until he has absolute objective peace that this is God's ordering. When he finally writes the proposal letter, he states he is doing it entirely out of obedience to discern divine will.
He subjected his entire romantic life to this 6-step discernment process.
But doesn't that make the Christian life incredibly dry? If you remove the passion, the spontaneity, the gut feeling from life's biggest decisions, aren't you just living like a robot?
It might appear that way from the outside, but the historical reality of Müller's life proves the opposite. He argued that basing your life on fleeting emotions is a recipe for constant instability. Feelings change with the weather.
That's
You
true.
can wake up exhausted and suddenly your gut is telling you a completely different narrative.
You're riding a roller coaster. High highs, but terrifying, unpredictable drops.
Exactly. But when your decisions are anchored in the objective truth of the Word and submitted entirely to God's will, the anxiety of decision-making is replaced by what the Apostle Paul in Philippians 4 calls the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding.
Hmm.
That objective peace creates a much deeper, vastly more sustainable joy. You aren't riding an emotional roller coaster, you're standing on solid rock.
So, with the theological groundwork laid the reliance on the Word, the 5 conditions of prayer, the rigorous, almost painful discernment of God's will, Müller stepped out of the theoretical realm. He walked into the arena where theology collides with brutal, unforgiving, real-world reality, caring for thousands of orphans without a safety net.
The crucible of daily dependence.
The journals detailing these daily miracles are breathtaking. They are the empirical proof he set out to gather.
They really are.
Let's set the scene for one of the most famous accounts. June 12th, 1838. It's morning at the Ashley Down Orphanage. Imagine the dining hall. Long wooden tables. Hundreds of children have been woken up. They're dressed, their faces are washed. They're sitting at the tables with empty tin plates and empty cups in front of them. The staff is standing against the walls looking at Müller.
And there is absolutely zero food in the building. The cupboards are bare. There is no money in the lockbox.
The sheer psychological weight of that moment is staggering. The responsibility for those vulnerable lives. But Müller doesn't panic. He doesn't pull a staff member aside and tell them to run to the local merchant and beg for a line of credit.
No.
He stands at the head of the table, folds his hands, and prays, thanking God for the food he's going to provide.
And within minutes of that prayer ending, there's a knock at the heavy front door. It is a local baker. He tells Müller that he had suffered from terrible insomnia the night before. As he lay awake, he felt a compelling, inescapable conviction that the orphans were going to need bread for breakfast.
Wow.
So he got out of bed at 2 a.m., fired up his ovens, and baked 3 massive batches of fresh bread, bringing them over just as the children sat down.
Which is miraculous on its own. But the journals recorded that almost immediately after the baker arrives, there's a second knock. It's the local milkman.
Yes.
His horse-drawn cart has suffered a mechanical failure and broken down directly outside the orphanage gates. He needs to lighten the load to fix the wheel, so he offers the entirety of his milk supply to the children.
It perfectly illustrates the theological concept that God is actively working while we are praying.
And it wasn't always massive deliveries of food. Sometimes it was just exactly what was required to survive the night. There's the story of the late-night gift. The orphanage was completely destitute, and pressing legal bills were due the following morning. As evening fell, Müller went to his knees and prayed specifically for the exact sum required.
And look at who God uses to answer the prayer.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't send a wealthy aristocratic donor. He sends a poor widow.
A widow.
She walks 3 miles in the dark from her home to the orphanage. She had recently sold some of her meager personal possessions and felt a sudden, intense compulsion by the Holy Spirit to bring the exact proceeds of that sale to Müller that very night. She had absolutely no knowledge of the impending crisis.
It completely upends our human expectations of how provision works. We assume massive projects require massive wealth.
The historical record shows God deliberately using the widow to prove he is not restricted to the wealthy elite to fund his kingdom.
Then there's the account from July 25, 1838. Müller is walking alone in his garden. The organization is facing another severe financial cliff. He's meditating on Hebrews 13.8, Jesus Christ the same yesterday and today and forever. He turns that theological truth into a direct prayer regarding his present anxiety.
Right, he reasons with God. He says, Jesus in his love and power has hitherto supplied me, and in the same unchangeable love and power, he will provide me with what I may need for the future.
And approximately 1 minute after he utters that prayer, a letter is physically handed to him containing a 20-pound bill. The note inside simply states it is sufficient provision for the exigency of today.
The exigency of today, just enough for the immediate need and not a penny more.
Here is where we have to stop and have a really difficult conversation.
Right.
I have to look at this through the lens of a modern auditor.
Okay.
Because to modern ears, a charity operating with zero reserve funds, waking up with hundreds of children to feed, and no food in the pantry, that doesn't just sound irresponsible. It sounds like negligent endangerment.
It does.
A modern board of directors would fire an executive who ran an organization like this. How did he sleep at night knowing one delayed donation meant starving children? How do we reconcile the beauty of the faith with the terrifying reality of the risk?
This is the ultimate clash of two completely incompatible worldviews. You are looking at the prudence of man colliding with the doctrine of providence. The conservative evangelical perspective drawn from these texts argues that what we call prudence is very often the sin of the conservative heart. Our deepest idol is self-sufficiency.
We want the math to balance out perfectly so we never actually have to trust God. We want to be our own providers.
Exactly. Müller deliberately and actively refused to create a sinking fund. He refused to save up a massive treasury when surplus funds did come in.
Why, though?
Because he recognized his own human weakness. He knew that if he had a massive bank account, his heart would trust the bank account, not God. He intentionally forced himself into a posture of terrifying daily dependence.
Yeah.
He viewed an empty lockbox not as an organizational failure, but as Christ's canvas, a blank space where God could paint a masterpiece of miraculous provision so the watching world could see. He is real. So for you listening right now, this is a radical paradigm shift. We so often trust our 401ks, our networking skills, our emergency funds, far more than we trust Jehovah Jireh, the Lord who provides.
Right.
What this text is pushing us toward is a completely different way of viewing our anxieties. Living for Christ fully means looking at the bills piling up on your counter, the financial crises looming in your life, not as sources of crushing, panic-inducing anxiety, but as literal, profound invitations to approach the throne of grace.
It is terrifying to our fleshly desire for control, but it is ultimate liberation for the human spirit. But wait, we have to escalate this. Trusting God for daily bread is one thing. You can wrap your mind around a baker having a sleepless night. But what happens when the scale shifts?
Yeah.
What happens when you realize God is calling you to build massive architectural infrastructure? What happens when you are facing down the literal uncontrollable forces of nature? This moves us from daily survival to scaling faith.
This is where the sheer magnitude of Müller's faith becomes almost incomprehensible. He discerned that it was God's will to vastly expand the operation, to purchase land and build new stone houses on Ashley Down to hold hundreds and eventually thousands of more orphans.
That's a huge leap.
The financial requirements didn't just increase, they multiplied exponentially. We aren't talking about 20 pounds for flour and milk anymore. We are talking about thousands of pounds for real estate and construction crews.
And his methodology did not change 1 millimeter. He didn't suddenly pivot and hire a capital campaign consultant. He didn't start hosting banquets for the Bristol elite. The journals detail how he went into his room and prayed day after day for 447 consecutive days until a massive 2,000-pound donation finally arrived to jumpstart the expansion. 447 days of silence and waiting.
That is the condition of importunity in action. He didn't quit on day 400 because he had already rigorously discerned in step 1 that the expansion was God's will.
And then there's the land purchase itself. This reads like a masterclass in faith-based negotiation. He needs a specific 18-acre plot for houses 4 and 5. But there are 3 massive, insurmountable obstacles. First, the landowner is demanding 7,000 pounds, which is exorbitantly over market value.
Oh, wow.
Second, there is a tenant currently leasing the land who aggressively refuses to leave. And third, a powerful local waterworks company is attempting to claim the exact same land to build a reservoir.
From a human legal perspective, the deal is completely dead. Any real estate broker would advise you to walk away immediately.
But Müller doesn't hire aggressive lawyers. He goes to his knees. He fights a 3-front war entirely in prayer. And what is the result? Without a single aggressive human negotiation, the landowner suddenly, inexplicably drops his asking price from 7,000 pounds to 5,500 pounds.
Just like that.
Just like that. The waterworks company discovers they only need a tiny peripheral sliver of the land that doesn't interfere with the building plans at all and drops their claim. And the stubborn tenant amiably agrees to break his lease for a modest, fair compensation.
Every single mountain moved, not by leverage, but by kneeling.
And his authority in prayer extended far beyond real estate. It extended to the weather itself. The account from November 1857 is legendary. It's the beginning of a bitter winter in England. A severe leak develops in the massive brick boiler that provides the heating system for House 1, which houses 300 children.
The physical danger to the children is extreme. The threat of pneumonia and freezing temperatures is very real.
To fix the leak, the workmen have to completely dismantle the complex brickwork surrounding the boiler, repair the iron, and rebuild the brick. It's a process that will take days. And just as they let the fire die out to begin the work, A bleak, freezing north wind sets in over Bristol.
Now, a normal administrator would have panicked. He actually did consider buying dozens of temporary gas stoves, but realized the logistics and the fumes made it impossible.
Okay.
So, left with zero human options, he falls entirely into the hands of God.
He prays for two incredibly specific things. First, he asks the creator of the universe to literally change the weather, to shift the freezing north wind into a warm south wind. Second, he prays that God would give the workmen a mind to work, referencing a phrase from the rebuilding of the wall in the book of Nehemiah.
The following morning, the Wednesday, they're scheduled to begin dismantling the boiler. The wind shifts. It blows from the south. The weather becomes so unseasonably mild that they don't even need a fire in the building to keep the children warm.
Wait, really?
Yes. But the second part of the prayer is just as miraculous. The workmen locate the leak. The supervisor comes to Müller and says the men have agreed to work late into the evening and arrive very early the next morning. But before Müller can even thank him, the lead worker interrupts his own boss and says, "We would rather, sir, work all night."
Wow. The exact prayer, perfectly answered. The climate shifts, and the men have a supernatural mind to work. They finish the entire massive repair in just 30 continuous hours.
Amazing.
And there is another weather account that just leaves you speechless. Müller is traveling on a ship across the Atlantic to Canada for a speaking engagement. A massive, dense fog rolls in, completely blinding the ship. The captain drops anchor. Müller goes to the bridge and tells the captain he has an unbreakable engagement in Quebec by Saturday afternoon. The captain scoffs and says it's physically impossible. Müller simply says, "Let us go down to the chart room and pray."
The captain thinks he's dealing with a lunatic.
He really does. Müller kneels down and prays one of the simplest prayers imaginable. He tells God he has an engagement that was made for his glory, and he asks for the fog to lift. The captain, feeling awkward, starts to pray as well, but Müller stops him.
He stops him mid-prayer.
Right.
He looks at the captain and says, "First, you do not believe he will do it. And second, I believe he has done it, and there is no need whatever for you to pray about it."
He opens the chart room door, and the dense fog has completely vanished. The captain is left standing there, absolutely terrified by the reality of the power he just witnessed. How do we process this? What is the theology of the impossible operating here?
What is crucial to understand is that faith, according to Müller, does not operate in the realm of the possible. If a situation is humanly possible to resolve, you don't need faith, you just need effort. However, this is the vital guardrail. His faith was never detached from Scripture. He didn't view himself as a wizard performing magic tricks. He only prayed for the expansion, the land, the south wind, and the fog to clear, because he had already undergone the grueling process of discerning that it was God's explicit will for him to care for those orphans and to preach that specific sermon in Canada.
He was completely aligned with the mission of the king, so he carried the delegated authority to command the obstacles to move out of the way.
Precisely. His authority in prayer was a direct result of his submission in life.
But this brings us to a deeply painful and necessary pivot. If we only focus on the miraculous provisions, the mountains moving and the fog lifting, we are painting a dangerously one-dimensional picture of the Christian experience.
Absolutely.
What happens when the answer is a hard, silent no? What happens when tragedy strikes? Did Müller ever face prayers that seemed utterly unanswered?
He did. And this leads us to the most profound and, frankly, the most challenging aspect of his entire life: the spiritual triumphs forged in the fires of ultimate submission.
Let's shift our focus from the financial miracles and the forces of nature to the deeply personal agonies. Let's talk about July 1853. Müller has one biological child, a daughter whom he loves dearly and who is a devoted believer. She contracts typhus.
This is where theology stops being an academic exercise and meets the deepest, most visceral human pain. The historical sources emphasize that Müller's greatest trial of faith was never about lockboxes or boilers. It was about surrendering his only child. As the days dragged on, the doctors offered absolutely no hope for her recovery.
This is a man who had prayed for millions of pounds and watched it materialize out of thin air. He had prayed for the weather to change and watched the wind obey. But now he's kneeling beside the bed of his dying daughter, praying for her life. And how does he pray?
He doesn't demand her healing. He engages in a grueling internal battle to bring his own heart to a state where he is entirely, completely satisfied with God's will, even as that will dictates her death. He wrote in his journal during the darkest moment of the illness, "I felt perfectly sure that if the Lord took this beloved daughter, it would be best for her parents, best for herself, and more for the glory of God than if she lived. This better part I was satisfied with, and thus my heart had peace, perfect peace, and I had not a moment's anxiety.
That level of surrender is almost unimaginably difficult to comprehend. To look at the impending death of your child and find objective peace in the character of God.
It is the ultimate, excruciating manifestation of "Thy will be done." He absolutely refused to use his faith as a crowbar to force God's hand. He used his faith to anchor himself to God's character while walking through the darkest possible valley.
As the historical record shows, after 59 agonizing days, the typhus broke, and she ultimately survived. But the true victory in that story wasn't her physical survival. The victory was his perfect, submitted peace in the face of her potential loss.
That intense spiritual focus, that prioritization of the eternal over the temporary, spilled over into how he managed the orphanages during crises as well.
Yes, there were terrifying periods of sickness on Ashley Down. During one devastating outbreak of measles, 262 children fell severely ill. There were bouts of smallpox sweeping through the houses. Müller prayed intensely that not a single child would die, and remarkably, God granted that specific request. But what the journals focus on isn't just the physical healing. It's the spiritual fallout of those trials.
The physical sickness often served as the catalyst for immense spiritual revivals within the walls of the orphanage. Hundreds of these abandoned children, facing their own mortality, were driven to prayer and ultimately found genuine salvation during these outbreaks. He cared for their bodies, but he lived for their souls.
And the spiritual impact of his radical obedience couldn't be contained within the borders of Bristol. It sent shockwaves across the globe. There's the incredible story of the 1859 revival. A young Irishman named James McQuilkin gets his hands on a copy of Miller's Answers to Prayer. He reads it and is so utterly devastated and inspired by the reality of a prayer-hearing God that he decides to act. He gathers 3 other young men, and they start a small, quiet prayer meeting in a tiny schoolhouse in Connor, Ireland.
And that tiny, obscure spark, ignited directly by the written testimony of Miller's faith, eventually exploded into the massive 1859 revival that swept across the United Kingdom and Europe, fundamentally altering the spiritual landscape of a generation.
So for you listening to this today, what is the core application? Loving Christ deeply doesn't mean you will never face typhus or financial ruin or deep sorrow. It means trusting his absolute goodness even when the answer isn't what your flesh desires. True faith is never a vending machine.
No, it's not.
It's not a mechanism to control the chaotic outcomes of a fallen world. It is a means of profound, unshakable communion with the Father. Are we genuinely willing to kneel down and say, "Thy will be done," and actually mean it, even when it costs us everything we hold dear?
That is the crucible where true faith is forged. And it's that exact depth of surrender that gave Miller's life such a massive, enduring ripple effect. His mandate changed how entire generations approached their work.
Just look at the revolution in the faith missions movement. Hudson Taylor, one of the most famous missionaries in history, was deeply personally inspired by Müller's writings and his friendship. When Taylor founded the China Inland Mission, he adopted the exact same radical principles.
He completely refused to solicit funds.
Right.
He refused to offer guaranteed salaries to any of his missionaries.
Yeah.
He relied entirely, 100%, on prayer.
And the result of that holy risk was over 700 missionaries deploying to the interior of China, supported entirely by the unseen hand of God's provision. It revolutionized modern missiology.
But the beauty of this framework is that it doesn't just apply to running orphanages or moving to China. There is a deeply practical story in the sources about a regular Christian businessman who sought out Müller for advice because his commercial business was failing miserably.
Yeah, I love this story.
Müller doesn't give him a new marketing strategy. He gives him spiritual directives. Pray twice daily with your wife, specifically about the business. Avoid all business trickeries, absolutely no shady marketing, no bait-and-switch tactics, complete transparency, and faithfully tie the significant portion of your profits directly to God's work.
He essentially told the man to run his secular business using the exact same moral and spiritual principles that govern the orphanage. And the historical record notes the result. The man's returns jumped from $6,609 to $9,138 in a single year. But the financial increase wasn't the point.
Right.
The point was demonstrating that God's principles of honesty, prayer, and generosity are just as effective in the marketplace as they are in the ministry.
And throughout all of this, the millions of pounds raised, the thousands of children fed, the global revival sparked, Müller maintained a fierce, almost aggressive dedication to Soli Deo Gloria. Glory to God alone. He actually delighted when anonymous gifts arrived.
He loved it.
When an envelope stuffed with cash showed up with absolutely no return address, he rejoiced because it legally left no room for him to write a thank you letter to a human being. It forced him to direct all his gratitude upward.
The ultimate synthesis of Miller's life is this. His personal definition of success had absolutely nothing to do with the number of brick buildings he constructed or the total amount of sterling in his ledger. Success was measured solely by how clearly his life magnified the invisible character of God to a watching world. Faith, as he lived it, was a muscle. And muscles only grow through severe resistance, through relentless exercise, and through the willingness to take what we might call holy risks. Okay, so if George Miller's life was this grand public laboratory experiment proving the reality of God, what are the actionable takeaways for your own laboratory of life today? How do you actually apply the Mueller mandate when you turn this audio off? The sources distill his entire life down to a few very practical daily steps. First, study the word systematically. Don't just read the Psalms for emotional comfort when you're stressed. Read the text consecutively, chapter by chapter, book by book, to truly learn the mind and the character of the God you are serving.
You have to deliberately move yourself out of the spiritual babe phase.
Second, bring exact, specific requests to God. Don't waste your time praying for vague, nebulous blessings. Pray for the exact amount needed for the rent. Pray for the south wind. Pray for the specific relationship to heal. Third, learn to embrace delays. Stop viewing God's silence as a denial and start viewing it as God's chosen, loving method for strengthening your spiritual endurance.
And fourth, keep your morning quiet time as the absolute non-negotiable priority of your existence. Müller famously wrote that his primary business every single morning was to have my soul happy in the Lord. That had to happen before he opened a single piece of mail, before he managed a single crisis, before he looked at the empty cupboards.
Because if your soul isn't deeply anchored in the objective peace of God's presence, you will inevitably be swept away by the crushing anxieties of the day.
It is a fundamental shift from carrying the crushing burden of your own life on your own fragile shoulders to deliberately rolling that burden entirely onto the infinitely capable shoulders of God.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today. We've explored how George Miller's answers to prayer serves as a historical, empirical proof that the God of the Bible is not a relic of antiquity. He is the God of today. By abiding deeply in the Word, by ruthlessly purifying our hearts from known sin, and by risking absolute terrifying dependence, we aren't just surviving the chaos of the modern world, we are being invited into a joyful, vibrant, dynamic partnership with the divine.
Amen to that.
Which brings me back to where we started this entire conversation, that corporate audit, that high security vault. We love our safety nets. We love our contingencies. We love our backup plans. Mueller proved God's unfailing, miraculous faithfulness while explicitly refusing to ever ask another human being for help. So I want to leave you with this final lingering thought. As you face your own insurmountable walls today, whether they are looming financial crises, devastating relational breakdowns, or deep, silent spiritual dry spells, who or what are you secretly relying on before you take your needs to God? What is your actual backup plan? And what would happen if you were brave enough to completely let go of it and gave God the blank canvas to be your absolute sole provider?